Yama Noa Nai. Naali Lu Wilayaba Ga Garagal Bada. Naya Gomori. Hello, my name is Noah. I would like to acknowledge that we are all here today gathered on the traditional homelands of the Garagal people of the Guringai Nation. I am Gomori. I'm a proud descendant of the Gomori people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here and the contributions that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across our continent have made to fight for our rights and our country since time immemorial. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people here because we are the future. We are the ones here. This will affect us going into the future and our children's. So it is so important that we take the time to consider, and we live in such a beautiful part of the world, and that we listen to country. And a lot of this discussion, it's so important that we listen to one another, but we also need to take time to listen to country and reflect on the beautiful country we are so fortunate to live on. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a proud descendant of the Gomori people of northwest New South Wales. This includes areas of modern-day Tamworth, Narrabri, Inverell and Moree. I am the Northern Beaches Young Citizen of the Year for 2023 and a member of the Australian Federal Government's First Nations Youth Advisory Group. I've lived here in Mackellar since I was 8. I'm 17 now. I come from both black and white families. I am black and I am white. Some might say I live in between these two worlds, but I live in one world, a world that sees these two cultures coming together. Both black and white, we must come together. To come together, we must listen to one another. I want to see a future where we are able to have an honest and open conversation and listen to one another. I can't vote in this referendum, but for those who can, let me paint a picture for why I think you should vote yes, and what it would mean for me and my generation. I want to grow up in a place where I can have my voice heard. The voice gives us structure and the ability to be heard. As Aboriginal people, the system has not been designed for us. And while we have our local members and our governments, they weren't designed to deal specifically with Aboriginal issues. The voice will be designed with the people in the process of co-design that will give all Aboriginal people a place to take our issues and a body that will make representation for us to government. I have been lucky to meet and work with governments, but I am only able to do this because of the privilege I have of living here. But so many First Nations people can't. They have not been given the ability to speak or aren't in the position to. And this is what the voice will change for my friends and my family and all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia. The Constitution of Australia was partially written in our electorate, and our community should come together so we can better it, make it better for the future. We must write yes, and we must come together to change the story of our country for good.
Noah, thank you so much for that wonderful acknowledgement and also those incredibly wise words. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank everyone for being here tonight and partaking in your democracy. A strong democracy absolutely needs the participation of its people, and so it's really wonderful to have you all here tonight. Thank you. The Uluru Statement of the Heart is an invitation to the nation to create a better future via proposed key reforms that we'll be discussing tonight. It's important to stress that the Uluru Statement is not an invitation to politicians only, but it is an invitation to all Australians, to you. So I want to thank you for being here, for getting involved, for asking questions, for getting informed, and for helping to decide what type of future we leave behind us. It is an exciting time because referendums really don't come around very often, and in one way or the other, you will be a part of making history and the choice is in your hands. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our wonderful panellists tonight, and just wanted to say as well that We'll be kicking off with some questions to get the discussion going, and thank you so much to everyone who pre-submitted your questions. There were many questions. We've put some questions together and we've curtailed a few, but we've tried to really keep the essence of everyone's questions and cover the whole gamut of questions. So thank you so much for submitting those questions. So first of all, we have Rachel Perkins. Rachel is an Arundara and Kalkadoon woman, a multi-award-winning filmmaker, a signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and co-chair of the Australians for Indigenous Constitutional Recognition. Thank you, Rachel, for being here. Next, we have Craig Foster. Craig is the 2023 New South Wales Australian of the Year, co-chair of Australian Republic Movement, broadcaster, adjunct professor, author, human rights activist, and of course, former Socceroo. Thank you, Craig, for being here. And next we have Jeff McMullen, Northern Beaches local, huge claim to fame. Journalist, author and filmmaker, Jeff has supported the struggle of First Nations people in Australia and around the world for over 5 decades. His focus is on improving education and health while addressing the fundamental human rights of First Peoples. Thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. Thank you. Rachel, I would love to start with you. Good, you've got a microphone. I'd like to start by inviting you to share your story, the story so far of the Voice to Parliament, your involvement in it. What's the history of this? How did we get here and why are we having our referendum now?
Oh, those are all big questions. I could just take the whole session. Thank you very much for coming out. It's so great to see this sold-out event. Amazing. So thank you very much for your interest in this subject. So I got involved with this about 8 years ago, and you know, I'm normally a filmmaker. I'm normally observing events and documenting them, and I had a conversation with a woman around a campfire once up in Arnhem Land, and because I sort of thought, oh, this is all up to the the leaders, the Indigenous leaders, and the constitutional experts, and I should just leave it to them, and they'll know what this is all about, and and then this friend of mine asked me to, help her. And I thought about it and I was like, well, actually, the Constitution is all of ours, It's a document that only the Australian public can change. And I thought, well, I might try and help out somehow. I'll just do what I can. I'm not an expert, I'm not a leader, but I'll just try and get involved and support the people who are pushing this through. Because actually, all leaders need great followers, which I learned growing up in my household. So I was like, I'll be a great follower and I'll come in and I'll support this where I can. So that's what I've been doing for the last 8 years. I went to the Alice Springs, it was Ross River, because I'm from Central Australia. I went to the Ross River Dialogue. There were 12 dialogues or 13 meetings around the country that led up to the Uluru Convention, and at those meetings, people elected representatives to go to the Uluru, the National Convention. These 13 meetings discussed constitutional recognition, what it could look like, what people wanted. So all of those discussions were then sort of distilled down at Uluru and discussed in depth over 3 days. And I went as a representative of my community and I participated in that. And yes, so after Uluru, I've been just doing different things on it, and now I'm the co-chair of the Yes Alliance, and that's how I sort of am arrived here tonight. But I should say that constitutional recognition has been talked about for a very long time. So Indigenous people have tried to find a place in the democratic process really ever since, British occupation. We've been trying to negotiate a way to participate with, the colonial governments and then later the federal government, the Commonwealth government. And so this has been a question that's, been written about, talked about for a very long time. as part of my work, I've gone through the archives and I've looked at these letters that have come from Indigenous people throughout over hundreds of years now, talking about trying to express their views about what their communities want and trying to engage with government and power. And so I've seen this sort of history in the archive and then in my own family of Indigenous people trying to talk to government about things that are relevant to them. So it's something I've grown up with. And now we have this process of a referendum upon us. But I should say that, so there's been that whole historical arc, but in 1995, actually, after the Mabo decision, my father, Charlie Perkins, was involved with a similar process. They went around to 17 regions and talked to Indigenous people about what their aspirations were after Mabo. And he wrote a report with other Indigenous people called Rights, Recognition and Reform. And one of the recommendations in that was that a process of constitutional recognition should be begun. So he didn't live to see that because those, like all the reports that we write, they mostly get ignored. One shouldn't laugh about that probably. Anyway, so, you know, he was involved in it and now I suppose there's another generation taking up that question. But I think it's important to understand, sorry, I won't take too long. It's important to understand, I think, when we talk about recognition, recognition can mean many things, right? It can mean a plaque, it can mean a flag, it can mean a badge, it can mean whatever, you know. So that was the thing that crystallised at Uluru because there'd been, you know, 5 prime ministers had supported the concept of constitutional recognition, you know, over the last 10 years. They'd all supported the concept, but Indigenous people hadn't been asked what they thought that form of recognition should take in the Constitution. So it wasn't until we got to Uluru that form of recognition really took shape. And so when we talk about recognition, we're talking about 2 things. We're talking about recognition of the deep roots of human existence on this continent. You know, that 65,000 years, it's actually unimaginable, the depth of time. A great archaeologist explained it's like 2 billion lives, you know, 2,500 generations deep. You know, it's deep time. It's something that makes us absolutely unique in the world, is that deep heritage of our nation. And so when we talk about constitutional recognition, that is the cornerstone. 65,000 years of enduring human occupation. And so like our British heritage and our multicultural heritage, that is a cornerstone of our identity. And that is why Indigenous people and many other Australians are calling for that recognition to be in the Constitution, our highest legal document. And so it's the leap then to the form of recognition. Indigenous people have asked for the voice. It's important to know that, so it has that symbolic importance, but it also has the practical form. And that's why it's quite a innovative, you know, way of recognising, because in all of the state and territory constitutions, there is already recognition of Indigenous peoples, but no one knows about it because it actually doesn't change anything, right? It's purely only symbolic. So this has the symbolism, but it has a practical application. So, yeah, that's a bit of an overview that's hopefully useful. You don't have to clap, that's fine.
Sorry, I'm back on. That was incredibly helpful. Thank you, because so many of us, it's so good to be able to understand where this has come from, those historical things, that deep, deep time that you're talking about, and how incredibly important that is, that we can't just sort of ignore that. Thank you for those words, and also your own journey and how intricately you have been involved, and your family has been involved in this process as well, and where this came from, and it came from Indigenous people. I might just ask you very quickly before we move on to the others as well, as where does Australia sit when comparing our story and these proposed reforms with what's happening in other countries, or what has happened in other countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in other countries, the strange thing about the settlement and occupation of Australia was that it was done without treaty. So you look at Canada, Aotearoa and New Zealand, which foundational document is the Treaty of Waitangi, the US, those countries have treaties, right? So we've never had that in Australia. So in a way, their recognition is through treaties. And like the Canadian Constitution has a clause that recognises treaties within it. And of course, the Treaty of Waitangi is recognition of Maori people. So those other countries have recognition through different mechanisms, but we've never had that, and we never had a treaty. And so it's just, we're sort of a rare bird in that sense. So yes, there's other comparative Commonwealth nations and other nations who have had recognition in their constitutions for a very long time. We just haven't done that yet. But in 80 days or less, this may or may not all change. And I should say that actually really happy to have discussions about, whatever people's views are. Like, we've got to have discussions, respectful discussions with each other about this subject. So that's really, I don't mind what people think. Everyone makes up their own mind, but I'm just here to offer, my views and perspectives, and hopefully that's helpful. I should say that, although it's just me here as the Aboriginal person on stage, we know that more than 80% of Indigenous people support this concept. And that's based on longitudinal data over many years. So often you'll see in the press, you know about this, Jeff. Press loves the conflict, it sells newspaper, good ratings. So, you'll get different Indigenous people arguing about this. And it seems like there's a lot of contest on this, but it's not actually the case. So it's consistent that it has overwhelming support from Indigenous people. And the thing is, like in the territory where I'm from, where we do have representative organisations, every Aboriginal Land Council in the Northern Territory and Northern Australia support this, plus most mainland land councils in New South Wales and other states. So it has overwhelming support. The National Native Title Council, representing traditional owners across the country, they are behind this. So the Assembly in Victoria. So it has huge Indigenous support. And at Uluru, it was a very wide sample of Indigenous people. It didn't represent every First Nations or every language group in the country. Huge sample though, overwhelming response. 7 people walked out of 250. So overwhelming consensus. So although I'm just here on the stage myself tonight, standing behind me are hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people who back this. Oh. Yeah. Some don't though, some don't.
Rachel, thank you. And I think it would be incredibly hard to find any group of humans anywhere in the world where there was 100% consensus on anything. So thank you again. Jeff, I'd like to turn to you and just have a discussion about the real life implications of having a voice. We hear every year that the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is not closing. In the latest report, we even heard that some of these gaps are widening. We hear statistics that First Nations people are dying earlier, and our young Indigenous people are more likely to go to jail than they are to go to university. So Jeff, you've been advocating for First Nations education and rights for decades. So we'd love to hear your opinion on how changing a few lines in the Constitution and having a voice to Parliament will actually help close that intractable gap and change the day-to-day lives of people.
If we want to have a positive change, clearly we've got to establish the facts, the evidence. And if you saw today's front pages or watched the evening news, there were 2 remarkable headlines. One came from the former Prime Minister John Howard, who would know a lot after leading the country for 13 years. And although he is not a voice supporter and has muddled through varying degrees of interest and support in constitutional recognition, he said something that we all should take notice of. He said the reason these dismal statistics are there in every annual Closing the Gap summary is because government is not good in this area. Government has not been good in this area, and he said across 30 years, the policies from the top had been constantly changing. I would add to that very deep in their lives, 2 other former Prime Ministers Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke, told me, and I have written about this so Australians should know what happened. Both Hawke and Fraser said their cabinets did not listen to the Indigenous advice. And Bob Hawke went to his grave feeling shamed that he had not honoured the promise he'd made to the First Peoples of this country. But the other story on the front page today is perhaps of more profound guidance for us to sweep away the misinformation, and as you work through how you're going to vote, listen to what is coming through via the evidence. The Productivity Commission report was actually commissioned by the coalition government under Scott Morrison, and it was looking at an agreement the COAG group, Fed, State and Territory, made in 2020, where the key agreement was that they were going to listen to the key advice from the Aboriginal peak bodies and from the community level, and they realised that the design of the system was failing Aboriginal people, just as John Howard has admitted. The system is rigged against an Aboriginal child born today. There is no way under this system that that child can arrive at equality and enjoy everything my boy and girl did growing up on Sydney's northern beaches. That is a fact. The Productivity Commission also shows us, indeed, the positive way to make the change that has to happen to the rigged system, because it's focused very sharply on how governments don't listen. They will say they're consulting, go to the Northern Territory or go to Campbelltown or Mount Druitt. It doesn't matter what part of the country the so-called consultation takes place. The government already has the plan drafted. They are hoping someone will nod and give them a tacit approval to go ahead with the plan. The key finding of the Productivity Commission is that disastrous decisions, like the Northern Territory government ignoring the common sense recommendation from the grassroots that you needed to turn off the grog when things were out of control. We would do the same thing in this RSL club. If the grog is out of control, you have to act and respond to it. But the government didn't act or respond to the grassroots advice. The Productivity Commission also slammed the Queensland state government and said, why were we, with young Aboriginal people going before the court, not having sensible bail conditions? We are putting children in jail in this country, 10 and 12-year-olds in some part of the country who are so often Aboriginal children are shuffled into this system. So the deep listening that Rachel has urged us to do, to hear the more profound connection to what it is to be here in Australia, not only have we shuffled that to the side, but we aren't really building the partnership to get the work done. Prime ministers can feel guilty and go to their graves feeling shamed, but we have to come back to the evidence. The system is rigged. A voice is not a panacea. It is, in fact, a mechanism built around hope that if you put the right input, you will get a better output. If you can design a system that truly takes heed of the advice from the people who are the most affected by the government policies, then you will improve policy. That is true across any area of life. You cannot disregard the evidence that this system is failing. So in our family, we think of this in terms of the child. If that child born today is not getting an equal share of the prosperity of the most hopeful and beautiful society on earth, what have we been doing in government where our taxpayers' money has been directed so poorly? with no auditing. So the Productivity Commission informs us independently we need a watchdog with teeth, was their expression. And deep in the report, you will see further solid argument that a voice designed efficiently, respectfully, getting the best people in to do this work will also require listening by the people in the bureaucracy and the government. But the design at the moment, the Productivity Commission emphasises, is broken. So the change has to occur inside the system, and we, the people, have that power in our hands to have a role in that design. I only wish to add a personal line of support for how beautifully Rachel really outlined what is being offered to us to share in. When the 7 to 10 white men went on that old paddle steamer out here on Pittwater, they left out 65 years, 65,000 years of the story. Now, you could say we can't erase history or even correct history. We're not seeking to do that. I say this is an opportunity through recognition in the Constitution to add the vital foundation stone to that Constitution. The Constitution is not some black letter law version of the 10 Commandments. Humanity itself is a work in progress, and we should see, as has been admitted by former Prime Ministers, and we are guided now by the Productivity Commission, we need to change some very fundamental things, and that is the key. Listening, the art of listening, is not something practiced by politicians. We have to teach them to listen.
I'm going to ask you a hard one, Craig, but I just want to make a comment on listening. We're hearing about listening a bit, and we know that in this electorate as well, so many people in the last election were not feeling like they were being heard or listened to. So this concept of being listened to is so deeply powerful. So thank you. Okay, Craig, you're up. So I've heard you speaking about the referendum in terms of the evolution of our nation and the need for truth-telling in order to grow and mature. And I was wondering if you could share a bit more about these ideas with us.
Great, yeah, thanks. It's lovely to be here. And I thoroughly enjoyed listening to these, extraordinary Australians framing this conversation, I think, really importantly and emotionally and very well. If perhaps I can just pick up on a couple of those points as well, which goes to your question. So much of this is about a deficit perspective and fear-mongering, which we've become used to in the country. But what's really important is that what's happening in this room is rightly changing Australia. And so what I think is very interesting is the movement that has brought Sophie into power and is now challenging our democratic system to strengthen it is actually about you having a voice. So many Australians felt, rightly, I did, that our wishes weren't being heard, that our representatives weren't truly representative, and that what we saw reflected in federal politics did not represent our feelings, our values, and our voice was not being carried there. Well, that's interesting, don't you think? That's interesting. So I think we need to do this more, but First Nations are carrying an incredible burden in helping us to do it really for the first time. And what worries me is that in a couple of years' time, I think this is going to be normalised and much more common, in part because of the movement in your own electorate. And I don't want people to look back and go, okay, now I get it. That's what we also wanted for ourselves. Now we listen to Jeff and, the depth of knowledge he has about the political system and how it works, and we can start to process properly the position that First Nations have been in. They've been screaming for a voice for 200 years. they've been screaming for politicians to listen. And you've already heard a very persuasive, factual case about why that does not happen. Reading recently Thomas Mayo and the great Kerry O'Brien's book, another of our famed and loved and trusted journalists, along with Jeff, which is an outstanding book that I commend to you all. And in that, I was interested to see the issue about ATSIC and how in 2003, it was John Howard, Prime Minister, who commissioned a review into ATSIC, and that review came back, and you know what it said? In 2004, it said, yeah, every system has problems, including the rest of a government, an executive government. However, what's happened is we feel that it's just lost connection to grassroots. So the institution itself is not listening well enough to the communities. Just fix that and move forward. That was the advice of his own review. He closed it in 2004, contrary to the advice. Now, what's important is, in 2018, there was a Senate estimates hearing, and the then Indigenous Minister, Amanda Vanstone, from 2004, when it was closed, 14 years later said, oh, I think it was a mistake. Now, how many times has that happened in this country? I started to form, views on this many years ago. I've been involved, particularly in sport and my game of football, in First Nations programs and so on. And I would go to the Northern Territory from time to time. I went to a place called Borroloola, and we were training some children there, and it was wonderful because I saw the extreme levels of disadvantage. And as it happened, the then Indigenous Minister was coming to town. And I was staying in the only caravan park there, and walking the streets and the awful houses, and just trying to find out what is going on here. And the Indigenous Minister came, and so the people in town weren't too excited because they'd seen it too many times before. But I thought, this is interesting. I might ask her a few questions while she's here. She came in around lunchtime, stayed an hour, and left. And we were there for 3 days, living there. It turns out that she was staying on a boat, a yacht, a couple of hours away in the Gulf. That was her accommodation. That's not listening. That is not listening. And that experience changed me. I went into the shop. And this goes to the point about the expenditure that we see on Facebook and everywhere at the moment, and all of these figures about what goes to Indigenous Australians. You've all seen it, okay? All of this money goes, and therefore, well, it doesn't matter how much you throw at it if it's not working and if government's not listening properly. That's obvious. Would we accept that for ourselves? No, you haven't accepted it. That's why you made a change. I went into the shop, and it was the worst food you could imagine. Now, you know that First Nations people, I think at least children, have the highest levels of diabetes in the world, or one of them, very close. I went in, and all I could find was fatty chips and awful Chico rolls. Sorry if anyone likes Chico rolls. And Coke, and it was the most sugary, fatty food you could ever find. There were no vegetables. The fruit was rotting. And I started to talk to the person there and said, how is this possible? And when I spoke to them in the community, they told me that shop or shops is not owned or run or managed by the community. The lease contract to the government for those shops across this area of the top end were owned by non-First Nations people who were profiteering from First Nations communities and selling a bottle of Coke for $10. So they are profiteering by making First Nations people sick. That's where the money is going. So I think it's just important. I wanted to mention that tonight because I see a lot of the stuff that's going around on social media, and people, whenever I post something, I see what people send back, and that's starting to increase. And you know what? Everyone's using the same figure, which means, this kind of thing is getting through to people. So that's extremely important for us to understand, okay? It's not working. It's time for us to come together And instead of a deficit mindset, what is it, how is Australia going to benefit from this? Well, for all of us, we can finally actually come together with First Nations people and genuinely look them in the eye and say that we actually care about you and we want to make a substantive, real change here, okay? We've done our homework, we realise that it hasn't worked, and you need to have an opportunity to be heard. I also come from the other angle from the human rights perspective, and any of those of you who are lawyers know that this has been very common around the world for First Nations peoples. That's why in 2007, the United Nations brought forward the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Australia took us 4 years to sign it. We weren't a signatory at the start, which I think is interesting. And 4 years later, Australia signed that document, and what it realises is that all First Nations and Indigenous peoples around the world have to be involved in decision-making. It's the one core principle. It's called self-determination, because otherwise they're not listened to. Doesn't matter if it's here or anywhere in the world. So for those of you who have an international view as well, you will know that this is just an important step that so many other countries have taken. As Rachel said, we're the only Commonwealth nation with Indigenous peoples without an agreement. And of course, you will all know that Cook was enjoined when he came to negotiate with what they called the natives at that time by the Royal Botanical Society, who sent him over here. He was told to negotiate. That negotiation never happened. It's happened everywhere else. It's time that we came together here. And I want to be able to say to the world that instead of just holding up in the Women's World Cup here, holding the flag, having welcomes to country, and holding this wonderful culture up to the world, I want to be able to say that we're actually doing something about it and that we're taking this country forward.
Not listening and not having a voice. And I do find it really interesting as well that we had the voices of McKellar here, and this is a voice to Parliament. Yeah, very similar. Thank you, Craig. Rachel, just talking about the evolution, what's been happening in other countries as well. We know there's a few parts to what the Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people are asking for: voice, treaty, truth-telling. Why, in your opinion, is this important to have those steps?
I was going to say there's 2 spare seats down the front here if anyone up the back wants it. If you get sick of standing, there's 2. I know it's a bit shame job walking in front of all the people. But there are 2 seats. No, they're too embarrassed. Okay, fine. So in the Uluru Statement, it calls for 3 things: voice, treaty, truth. Well, it doesn't call for treaty, it calls for makarata, which is a Yolngu Matha word from Yirka, from northeast Arnhem Land, which is a word that describes a resolution coming together after conflict. And so the voice, it's sequenced in that way for a very particular reason. It asks for a voice because we are 3.8% of the population, right? And we are the only group in Australia that has special laws made about us. And, they're not making laws for Greek Australians, are they? So they make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So because we're such a small minority, our vote doesn't really count. We don't really have that impact in the democracy. So that's why the voice asks to give advice on those laws. So I think it's very important to know that it is only an advisory body. It can only make representation. It can make representation to the Parliament, so to bills that are going through, but it can also make representations to the bureaucracy, importantly. So there was a whole lot of, toing and froing in the Parliament about whether it should be able to make representations to the executive. But it was important that it does that, because at that executive level, at the bureaucracy level and with ministers, that's where a lot of the program development happens. So it's about cutting through the bureaucracy, actually, rather than creating a new one. It's about the voice being able to speak to those bureaucrats when they're shaping policy, because we know that, I mean, there's strong evidence that shows internationally and in Australia, when you get the advice and you involve the people who the programs are designed around, that those programs are better designed. And you see that in all sorts of areas of our life, don't you? So that's the sort of rationale for the voice, that it will exist in our democracy as the cornerstone part of the Indigenous participation in the Constitution. And the enshrinement is important in the Constitution, because obviously you could legislate it first, right? The government could have legislated this, like they could have legislated it, Scott Morrison's government could have legislated it, this government could have legislated it, but they've gone to referendum on this. And the constitutional enshrinement is important for two reasons. One, it means that it will endure. So although the Parliament has the right to decide the form of it, how many people are on it, how many regions it might represent, how many times it meets, like that's up to the government, right, to work out that detail, and that will happen after the referendum. But what constitutional enshrinement means, it will be there. There must be a voice. So whatever the form of the voice, and it will evolve over time, it should be able to adapt. Like all organisations, they adapt and change as they need to. But constitutional enshrinement means it will be there. The second thing about constitutional enshrinement is that it means that it gives it sort of moral power in a way, because it has the Australian people standing with it. So if you decide to support this, and if it's successful at referendum, it's like the Australian people are saying to politicians, you should listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we know that has value for politicians. The Australian will of the people is regarded. Indigenous people's views might not be regarded, but the majority of Australians' view has regard. And so that gives it strength. So even though it's only an advisory body, it can't have veto over government, it can't overturn government decisions. In fact, the government can choose to ignore the advice. That's actually in the constitutional amendment, that the government does not need to heed the advice. The power of it comes in your support. So that's why, that's why we're asking for you to back us, because you can only really enable us to be heard. It's your voice gives us a voice. But back to your question very quickly, the sequencing. Voice comes first because that's part of constitutional enshrinement. A treaty or agreement making, that actually can happen any time, right? Because that's a choice with government to do so. We see that in Victoria, they've got a treaty process underway, but that's taken 5 years just to get, the elected body together, and now they're embarking on the beginning of that negotiation. This referendum is with us now, 80 days or so away. And then truth-telling happens last, because in other countries like South Africa, for example, or South America, we've seen these truth commissions where, people pour their hearts out and it's all compiled in a book, and then nothing changes. Like, it's a great emotional outpouring, it's very important, but then maybe there's no change. So that's why truth-telling is last, so that the structural change that enables us to empower ourselves to change our position at the bottom rung of Australian society, that happens first. So that's why the order is in that way.
Thanks, Rachel. And thank you. We do have to clap, we do. Jeff, would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
To add to the sequence of events that Rachel's describing, I'd urge you to find the essay that historian John Maynard, who I'll tell you is a friend of mine, but it was John's grandfather, Fred Maynard, back in the 20s, that really started to crystallise the power of voice. And then in the 30s, William Cooper also was rallying people to try to pamphleteer and elevate the constructive advice to try to prevent some of the disasters that would occur when governments blundered on without listening to the people. And you would go through this long sequence of history that John Maynard writes about. You'll find that in the conversation, on the website for the conversation. And by the time you got up to government-controlled, government-appointed advisory bodies, you find that eternal problem that Rachel has described and Craig reiterated. They can be just swept away at whim. Howard has told us that. The policy kept changing. The advisors kept of the hand-picked people who were gathered in to support the plan that had been drawn up. That is not advice from the grassroots. It is not expert-level advice. But regardless, it was swept away at the whim, at the change of governments, or at the weakness of cabinet decision-making. When we get to the immediate era, where we have a genuine crisis occurring, and we still see governments that have ignored key Aboriginal ministers. Why did Ken Wyatt step away from the party? Why is Ken Wyatt the first appointed Minister for Aboriginal Affairs? Why is he saying it is important to elevate this advice? It is important to recognise and support the voice. Why did the former Shadow Attorney General and Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Julian Leeser, leave the fold and step out bravely? Why today do we have our former Foreign Minister in those coalition governments bravely at the National Press Club say she too sees the logic of the voice and that she supports this step forward? The truth is that the sequence back through our history shows you how often First People have tried to formulate a partnership, a constructive advice. It's not about total control. It's not about running parts of the country. It is about elevating that respect that was there between Vincent Lingiari and Gough Whitlam, when old man Lingiari said, when we get this done, then we can be mates. I would like to think mateship is something John Howard, who's spoken often about it, would deeply understand. So we have to listen, we have to respect, we have to find the right facts-based conversation to move us forward. But we have to realise, as Rachel said, really it is deep. It is 2 centuries of desperate calling out by Aboriginal people that could have presented disasters. The disaster that we are staring at in Australia today, the social crisis, where we are not hearing the voices, is the dramatic surge in the removal of Aboriginal children from their families, putting them into state care. If Australia had listened to those wise people that we've named all the way back through history, we would not have had a stolen generation. But the truth is today, with over 20,000 First Nations children removed from their families, sometimes babies taken from their young mother's arms in our hospitals, we have an ongoing stolen generation. The evidence of the inquiry in our state here in New South Wales is that over the decade of Liberal government in this state, we've seen such a dramatic increase in children being removed from their families that we have, if you want to really know the truth, an ongoing stolen generation. It hasn't ended. They haven't listened. And yet go to Moree, where the grandmothers against removal have organised the right intersection with families in need. And this government, the Minns government's focus now is to try to look to that and see how did they manage to slow the removal of the children? Why are the babies not being plucked from young mothers' arms? It's because of the grassroots, the knowledge, I would say the wisdom. It hasn't been heeded for 2 centuries. But for the sake of all of our children, these are Australia's children. It's not just a vote. You've got to think deeply about it. Work out your view on it. Raise your voice and act. We can't allow this to go on. We don't want this on the history of our generation to allow this to happen to Australia's children.
There was going to be a question about how this voice to Parliament would be different from previous bodies, but I think, Rachel, that has been answered so beautifully. The moral power of Australians standing behind this voice is what will make it very different from any previous advisory body. Thank you. They're extremely powerful conversations we're having. Craig, I'll turn to you. The Yes 23 campaign director, Dean Parkin, recently said that he feels there is a lot of goodwill out there and that people really want to vote yes. You're out there talking to a lot of people. What are you seeing and feeling and hearing?
Well, let me just make this point firstly to that. So Rachel talked before about over 80%, and I saw there was one of the questions was around that, 82, 83% has hovered around there of Indigenous Australians in very strong support here. My question to all the audience is, because we now see a lot of really loud voices, and it is very true that the media finds, firstly, it likes conflict, obviously. Secondly, it wants to be seen to be trying to put an alternate view forward, and therefore it can become very outsized and much louder even than the 80% who are trying to be heard. But there's no space for people who just issue a statement to say, look, we're in support here. You know, we don't really need to say a huge amount. That's important. So my question to you is, if we had any question in this electorate or elsewhere in Australia where the poll came out tomorrow and said there's 83% of Australians on board, how would you interpret that? We don't see that too often in any question that Australia's facing. That's massive support. Any politician or any community campaigner or any human rights advocate would see 80+% as overwhelming. So that, I think, is the first important point to make. But we are all being bombarded, and at least some of the media is starting to cut through the organisations that are involved in this now, and who are in many ways undermining democracy, because democracy is about us having access to the truth. It's not actually about us just having access to filth and misinformation and complete rubbish. What we need to do, a democracy is for the citizens, for all of us to be fully informed. But that means that we have to have all the facts, and the various viewpoints can be put forward without introducing untruths. So that's a difficulty that we're all facing now. And I think the Yes campaign and Dean and others are really wrestling with that. And with other big questions that Australia is facing in future, many of us are also watching and trying to work out how is it that we are going to, as a people, be able to cut through that. That's why we need, I keep saying, First Nations are carrying a huge load here, and we have to take responsibility. We have to do our own homework. We have to make sure that what we're reading is accurate. We have to check. We can't just digest what's being thrown at us. Because, for example, one of the great ironies about this, what has been called a modest offer, one of the great ironies is that some people are saying it's way too much at the same time that others are saying it's not enough. And so what you have is some campaigns here saying the same thing at the same time. So they're targeting some people to say, well, yes, we know that you're in support of First Nations growth, but this isn't going to do enough. So vote no. And then the same campaign is targeting other people with the opposite message, saying this is going to give way too much power. And it's coming from the same people. It's not truthful, it's not authentic, it's not real, it's not fair. And that's what really upsets me.
It's effective, though.
That's the problem.
That's the problem.
And so we're starting to see... Sorry, go on, Rachel. Okay. Thank you. I was saying we're starting to see, in answer to your question, we're starting to see this fed back to us when we have conversations, and that's how you know that it's getting through. And so that is a concern. We can all agree in this room, I think, after what you've heard here and what we all know about the history of Australia, that Indigenous rights and Indigenous issues have been a political football, to use a sporting term. Well, we could all agree that, right? The problem, as I see it at the moment, is the whole conversation at federal political level is not real. It seems to me that it's about attacking this government and attacking Albanese more than it is about what is in the best interests of Australia. That's my view. And what we really need is politicians on both sides who want what is in the best interest in this country and are prepared to prosecute that truthfully to us. And then let's have a real conversation. At the moment, it's about damage and it's about trying to bring people down. That's why we have to take responsibility. And that's going to take a lot of work in the next 80 days from every single one of us, because we're going to have to influence people and cut through so much of the garbage that's being sent to them.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Craig. And I just want to reiterate that as well, is the power of the conversations that each of us can have within our families, within our friendships, with our colleagues as well. That's the power. That's how change happens. And so we are hearing a lot of rubbish. And actually, I have a couple of questions about that have been submitted that were for me, and I might just address them now on misinformation and disinformation, and then throw to you, Jeff, as well as a journalist back in 1967 when the previous referendum was on. So Richard from Mona Vale and Graham from Davidson both wrote in and asked about my position on the Labor government's misinformation bill. The truth in political, Zali Steggall actually had a truth in political advertising bill. And this is a relevant issue because it's been in the media a lot recently about the pamphlet, and the fact that actually it's totally legal and fine to lie in political advertising. You can be misleading, deceptive. The AEC doesn't have any powers currently to do anything about that. It's legal. It's very different from our own commercial and corporate laws where it's not legal to lie in advertising. So we have a pamphlet, but it's not able to be fact-checked before it got sent out. And I just want to say, Zali Steggall, last term before I was elected, she did introduce a Stop the Lies bill. And I think that's such a powerful thing, where it was all about truth in political advertising to make untruths illegal. And then she tabled that just at the end of last year because she knew that the referendum was coming up, and she knew this would be an issue. If there was a pamphlet, then it was still legal to be misleading or deceptive in those pamphlets. So that unfortunately was not voted upon. If it had been, we might be in a different situation right now. So I 100% absolutely support a truth in political advertising bill to be put through. And I think, yeah, sure. I think we all do. We all know that there's so many different pillars of integrity that we need to, that are upholding our democracy, and truth in political advertising absolutely has to be one of them. So that's something that we'll continue to look at as well. And Jeff, I would like to throw to you on this because I would like to know what you're seeing, what the difference is between what we're seeing now with the media and the misinformation, and what was it like back in '67 with the referendum back then?
The media now are certainly absolutely addicted to conflict, as Rachel said. It's a business formula. It's attention grabbing. And so at an important moment of our history like this, you're not getting serious attention to any of the arguments. There is a spectrum, yes, no, and everything in between. and it needs very thoughtful writing to be able to allow you to do the reading, the deep thinking yourself, the round of table conversations. I don't think the media generally have served this referendum wisely, because from the beginning, as Rachel pointed out, it was framed in that political area, and the media reports it like a contest, like a race, like who's winning. On this issue, that isn't the focus. It is about what is right, what is just, what will change, what is broken. The media is not good at that. There has been some wonderful filmmaking, some very thoughtful discussion, and that writing shines through. And Craig has recommended books. We could add more that Marcia Langton and Megan Davis have edited, essays of yes and no perspectives. There are attempts to try to crack the matrix and let some light shine in for us all to get to the facts. But what I have noticed that arrived and was not there in 1967 is this American style. I hate to say it aloud, it is Trumpist. There are American companies supporting the marketing of the lies that Craig has said are bald-faced lies. But in the bigger perspective, don't panic. Politicians do lie. Everyone in this room knows that. They don't lie all the time, but they will try to justify their lies and later shamefully admit it was a mistake. The misinformation is a global phenomenon, and it is growing because of all of the media that you understand, the social media, the lack of regulation, the lack of a community understanding of even how the disinformation is being spread. It can undermine democratic election systems, so it should be taken very seriously. For this referendum, which is an historic opportunity for our country, we have to decide how we see ourselves as a nation, and the rest of the world will be watching us. So allowing disinformation to sway your vote is dangerous. It's like surrendering to an AI robot and allowing them to put the chip in your head and have you decide. The brochures have not helped this because, as Sophie says, the lack of fact-checking. But the media can be fact-checked, and they can fact-check themselves, and they can address the blatant big lie that is going on. So we should thoughtfully listen to all of the perspectives about the choice. We should try to understand how difficult it is to actually change the Australian Constitution, which we haven't touched on so far tonight. It's not only that we're conservative, the Constitution and the possibility of change is more difficult in this country than most other situations. So if we are going to be united to make the change, we're defying certain historical patterns where through apathy, lack of information or manipulation by governments at that time, they have made it impossible for people to truly come to grips with the issue. That clearly happened during the Republican debate. If we go back to 1967, there was no organised opposition. I was a very young ABC reporter listening to some of the wisest Aboriginal men and women, some of the greatest Aboriginal men and women, some of the Australians that I will treasure to my grave. I was listening to them in the street. And Australia listened to those voices from the street. With no organised opposition and bipartisan political support, the country focused on the detail of the change. It was, in a simple form, actually recognising the humanity of one another. And how can we not deny that, everybody said. But the assumption was, if we the people spoke, that change would be carried through and the hopefulness of 1967 would be heeded. It is why, as has been suggested, we the people can hold any government to account if they don't respect what we decide in a referendum. That's the power of what Rachel has advocated here. The constitutional enshrinement gives extra authority. It can draw on all of the Indigenous peak bodies' wisdom and practical experience, but then it can, in a cogent way, set the priorities, and as the Productivity Commission requests, it can audit where is your money going and what is it achieving. And if not, change the government. If they fail us when we, the people, choose to put this design into our constitution, then we change the government. Sadly then, this is the history of this country, that we have not carried through what the people signalled with the unity of purpose in 1967. It was a very hopeful time. Those placards were simple. Vote yes for Aborigines. Who could not, in their head, support that? It's not only about emotion. It's not simply from the heart. It is to understand that we are really talking about humanity. You may have different priorities. You may actually reason that this could have been done another way. I would love to rewrite great chunks of the Constitution personally. I don't think it serves us well in many ways, but as Rachel said, that's not on the table. The opportunity is on the table. We need to do the work to understand it and then take it away from the politicians. Those voices that are now simply up on the soapbox, screaming at one another with all of the hate, with the media lapping it up, they are not the voices of reason to listen to. Try to hear the spectrum of Aboriginal points of view, think and read deeply about it, and I am certain, I trust you in your common sense to come to the best conclusion.
I think one thing's fairly certain. It wasn't an invitation for this to be used as a political football. We've got about 20 minutes left, and so I wanted to try and pump through a few of the questions that were pre-submitted. And one of them actually is very relevant to what we're talking about at the moment. And this is from Chris in DY, who asks how to respectfully challenge viewpoints that are based on disinformation. Maybe Craig, would you like to hit that? Rachel? We have to be quick. 20 minutes, okay.
No, you go there, but we have to be quick.
Well, the only answer I have is that we have to respectfully have these conversations with everyone, and that's critically important. And so people have a right to disagree, people have a right to have opposing views, but we need to come to the conversation in good faith, and I was talking about bad faith before. So those people, it's clear that they just don't want to change for whatever reasons, and there's there are some Australians in that area. There are people whose mind can't be changed. But if we come to it, you genuinely want to do what is right for this country and for the traditional owners of this country, then we can come into that space and keep the conversation open. Those who have had disinformation, well, the best that we can do is try to bring to their attention the campaign groups that are now involved, that Jeff talked about, the fact that so much of what they understand and are regurgitating is false, and try and keep that conversation open long enough to change their mind. Most people in Australia are wonderful human beings, and they can, I believe, arrive at the right decision given the right information. Unfortunately, I'm receiving things where there's like 40 reasons as to, what's wrong or what's going to go wrong. It's just absolutely shocking If it's someone in your family, you have to sit them down and try and work through why those things aren't accurate. Go on.
I'm going to send you Shelley Ray's fact-checking. Great Aboriginal, reasonable, rational and clear. And Shelley Ray's, R-E-Y-S, if you Google the name, she whips through the lies, the misconceptions, and it would address, I bet, about 20 of the 40 that were sent.
Is it a website? What is it, a book? Or?
It's an individual. It's up there on YouTube. So Shelley, R-E-Y-S, and has, Rachel would know of her career, great experience in reconciliation work, but a professional woman, very smart, and said, I'm sick of hearing all of reading the media and being bewildered by how much misinformation is there. So she did something. She just set about, in a balanced way, looking at the facts. It's good.
Right. I'll certainly be pushing that out.
Thank you, yes. And I think the issue is that people have been trying to complicate it and muddy the waters, and really it is a very simple concept in many ways. Recognition, listening. And my question is, what's so scary about listening? So, as well. Okay, Murray from Balgala has asked, what's the relationship, and might put this to you, Rachel, what's the relationship, or what would it be, between The Voice and existing First Nations organisations and groups, including local groups?
Okay, I might wrap two questions into one in this, if I may. So you've all got the Constitution there with you, and you'll see, like, who's read the Constitution, right? Most boring document in the world. I've read parts of it, select parts. But the Constitution operates as a very high-level rule book. And so in relation to, say, the High Court, it has one line. There shall be a High Court or something like that, it says. Similar to the army. It doesn't say how many tanks, it doesn't say how many soldiers, it just says that you will have the right to raise an armed forces or something like that. So so the Constitution functions as that sort of senior document, and then the detail happens in legislation, and that is up to the Parliament. And the Parliament, parliamentarians will have the role in shaping the detail of the voice with Indigenous people, and the detail will change over time. So a lot of people are saying, where's the detail? What are we voting on? Well, the Australian people are voting on a very clear provision that will go into the Constitution. That's our role. That's what we do. And then we delegate the power to our elected representatives to work out the detail. So that is why there are people saying, where's the detail, where's the detail? Well, it's up to our elected representatives to shape the detail with Indigenous people. That's why we don't have it. But what we do know is that there's some principles that they've agreed to. Very importantly, it should have gender equality. Very important to us in our communities to have a balance, particularly for the representation of women. And we do know that it will represent remote regions. And there's some other principles around accountability, and that and we know what it won't do. It won't have, it won't give out grants, and it won't administer programs. So in a way, by knowing what it won't do, we can sort of see what it might do. The other thing is that the principle is that it is grassroots based, right? We don't want to just have a bunch of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Canberra. The idea is that it comes from the grassroots, because the continent is so huge and so diverse and people's situations are so different. You need to have voices from regions, right? So my people in Alice Springs have a completely different situation from people in Redfern. So the programs and policies need to be different. So it's devised that there will be regions and there will be local groups who will form in those regions to give advice to the government on their issues. From those regions, they will elect a national body, because, of course, you need some sort of coordination to look at what are the big, themes that they want to comment on. And obviously those themes will be things like housing, health, education, those big ticket issues for Indigenous Australians. Now, the Attorney General, who is the highest advisor, legal advisor to the government, who was appointed under the previous coalition government. So he gave advice to the government about the provisions in the Constitution that are going to come in. as he does on all issues, right? And that advice was released. And it's very important what that advice says. It says that it will enhance the process of democracy in this country insofar as it will hear the voices of Indigenous people who haven't previously been heard in the process. So that's very important. He's not some like crazy lefty, right? He's the Attorney General appointed under the coalition government saying that this will enhance democracy. He also said, I keep on saying Solicitor General, sorry, that's because I'm in like historical, thinking about like the 1830s. He also said that that the Voice will comment on issues that it sees as a priority, because there's been a lot of conversation around, oh, it's going to stop Parliament from functioning, it's going to derail the whole process, it's going to comment on everything from parking fines to submarines. And he said it will naturally prioritise the issues that it sees as relevant. And so he thought that the potential for it to slow down the parliamentary process was extremely unlikely. So this is factual, good legal advice. So I'm just trying to talk about the shape of the voice because we've got a question around detail that's coming. There is a report that Professor Marcy Langton and Tom Cowmer, who's the Elder Australian of the Year, prepared on the Voice. They went around to like 17 regions, talked to Indigenous people all over the country. They issued this 235-page report to Scott Morrison's Ken White, gave it to Cabinet twice. It puts proposals of what the detail would look like, what it could look like. And the government's chosen not to. Scott Morrison chose not to select a version of that, and this current government hasn't confirmed what version of that will be the first shape of the Voice. But in that document, it was proposed that there might be 34 regions and that you need that sort of diversity because there's such diversity in the country, and that it might then go up to a group of 24 people who would be the national voice. Now, these people would probably have a little office, little secretariat, and that would help them, it would probably have some researchers, to prepare papers and to review documents, and it would probably travel to Canberra maybe 4 times a year. Now, that's what we're talking about. And people are talking about it like it's going to be the end of the world, right? But that is going to be like the shape of the Voice. It'll be something like that. That's sort of the broad detail of what it may look like. I can't say for sure, of course, but it will be somewhere in that region. So in terms of how it will relate to existing local groups, the Langton and Calmer report says that it should acknowledge and include those sorts of organisations, but that what's key to it is that people in the regions will decide how their voice works, right? So in Victoria, where you've got an elected body already, and South Australia, where you've got a new voice that's been legislated, they'll probably say, well, the South Australian model of the Voice, that's the model we'll have. And in Victoria, they might say, oh, well, we've already got the first assembly, they're democratically elected from our regions, that'll be our voice. So people have got that autonomy to decide how they want to be represented. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So that's sort of the detail, and that's how it'll work with existing organisations. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. Oh. Craig, please comment. I'll just say that we do have just to pop it in there, because we are answering questions as we go along. I can't keep up. But Jason from Coleroy Plateau and Sarah from Monaval asked a similar question to each other around whether we are being provided with the complete details of the proposed changes. So I thank you. You're answering it. Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to just perhaps add a little perspective on that as well, because it's really critically important. What Rachel was saying is the Calman-Langton report is, I think, 215 pages long. It's got 9 principles as to how it operates, has the 3 different levels, local, regional and national. The report is nothing but detail. Now, what I would like you to understand is that, and I'm in all of these conversations non-partisan. I don't care which government's in power or who's not. All I want them to do is just to operate authentically, truthfully and fairly. That's my only concern. But I will say that what Peter Dutton did in this, in this conversation that Australian people need to have about our shared future, by then saying, well, where's the detail, is a diversion, it's improper, and it worked. Because in Australia, It's not clever, it's not genius, but it's dangerous because Australians, we do feel that equality and fairness is right, and there is a mistrust in politicians for good reason, and therefore by saying that and planting the seed improperly in Australians' mind as oh, something's being hidden here, it has an impact, but it's completely wrong. All of the work has been done in the report. Now that has to be accepted by the government, but not only that, when it's put in the Constitution, it's our parliamentarians who are going to be discussing the structure and the bill to put this together. So we have democratic access to what it looks like. He didn't say that. Secondly, what he's saying is, well, we don't want a national, but we want regional and local voices. Oh, so you do want the voices? Okay. But then you're not worried about the detail on those ones. I don't hear anything about the detail on those ones that you're happy with. That, to me, is the problem here. It is not fair. It's not real. And that call for detail right from the start is something we all need to understand. It's not just about the fact that, you know, in here, in section, chapter 3, the judicature talks about the High Court. Of course you can't put all of the structure in here, or it'd be an entire library. It would be the entire legal policies of Australia would have to be in the Constitution. Like, it's patently ridiculous. So let's all please understand that these motives behind these things are much more important than the actual statements that are being made. Understand what's being done to us. It's not right. It is not right. All that needs to go in here is that this needs to be, First Nations need to be recognised, and that needs to be a mechanism to bring that to life so that they can have a voice. That is all that needs to go in here. We will then all, through Sophie and everyone else, decide what that then looks like.
Thanks, Craig. I've heard it described very similarly as if we were voting on whether there should be a harbour bridge, it'd be yes or no. Would we vote on whether it had 6, 8, 12 lanes, whether it was an arch or a suspension bridge, whether it went from A to B, B to C or C to D? We would never get there, and we would not have a harbour bridge. So something to think about.
I think it's true, though, people are responding to when they say, what is the detail? They do want to know what it is about, I think, They do need to have that question answered, I think, though. It's important that people understand when they're saying what is the detail, they do want to know, like, oh, it's got regions, right. Oh, it's got a national thing, yeah, okay. And that's going to relate to that. Yeah, good, now I've got it, okay. And if you get the broad information, I think that's a legitimate question. And so I think those explanations are useful because some people think, well, is it just one person or is it, Australians aren't all going to read the 250-page report, right? Not even going to read the Constitution. So it is important, and I'm not disagreeing. I know it's a tactic, but it is a legitimate question people have, and you have to answer those questions respectfully,
Yes, totally agree. Thank you. So we've got a number of questions here that have been touched upon or answered, but I might just pump them out. We've only got a few minutes left.
30-second responses each.
70 seconds. 20 seconds.
Do you want to do the time? You can do the timer. Yeah.
Ray in French's Forest asks, will the voice to Parliament have the power, we've kind of touched on this or talked about, will it have the power to override or veto decisions made by Parliament or to mandate decisions? And if the advice from the voice is not acted upon, will it end up being contested in the High Court? Rachel?
No veto. Question done. It doesn't have the power to veto Parliament. Everyone knows that. The best legal minds in the country all agree on that. There's no question. And in fact, it's in the constitutional amendment that it says, Part 5 says that, I don't have it off the top of my head, but it says Parliament will not be obliged to act on the advice of the voice. 15 seconds.
Way to go. Good.
Thank you very much.
There's another one here I've put together. Sonia from French's Forest asks how to respond to the argument that the voice isn't wanted by First Nations people, and Guy from Bayview asks for recent statistics on Indigenous support for the voice. We've also touched on this.
I think so.
Yep, thank you. Zoe from Eleanor Heights asks, if you want a pathway to treaty, is a yes vote better than a no vote?
Yes.
We're going
Yes
well.
vote better than a no vote. If you want more, right, if you on the progressive no, which wants more, if you vote no, then you're not giving anyone a mandate to change anything. Because people will say they don't support this, they don't support Indigenous thing, they don't want anything to change, so nothing's going to change. So no means no change to anything.
In the same vein, it was mentioned earlier that to establish a national treaty, as in overseas nations, as we're the only Commonwealth country that doesn't have a treaty with its First Peoples, but there is a great deal of work to be able to have the mechanism, the convention-like process. Most of the Aboriginal constitutional lawyers, and I have supported the treaty movement all of my working life and sat with the sovereignty camps in the desert. Most of the constitutional lawyers think that is going to take so long, which brings us back to a no vote is oppositionist, a yes vote, understand what is involved in the yes vote, and then there may be a more respectful attention to the agreement-making phase that must occur. I mean, we see hopeful things. In Victoria today, they took a step forward together in that state for agreement-making. We've seen a successful agreement over in Perth with the Noongar people. It's underway, as Rachel said, in several other states. But it takes a lot more time. We have an opportunity to focus on what that Independent Productivity Commission has reminded us of today. We can do better. They are showing us the evidence where to do better. And this is what is involved in the referendum, a chance to act now and to be involved in the design of a constitution that reflects deep time reality.
Yes, thank you.
You went over your 30 seconds. This isn't 60 minutes, 30 seconds. That's different. Oh, come on, you got to get a gag, you know, like, you got to get a few gags in this discussion.
Exactly,
Because
it hasn't
the
been me.
Constitution's so boring.
Eliza from Narrabeen asks why the process can't be set up first, trialled and evaluated before going to the vote about whether this should be made a permanent change by enshrining the voice in the Constitution. So why can't it be just trialled and evaluated first?
Well, we have had Indigenous advisory bodies before, right? This is not the first. In fact, 5 in my lifetime. So we have been through this process. It's not our first, what do they say, rodeo. So people just want it, you know, we're not doing that again. We have asked the Australian people with respect, not politicians. That's why the statement is to the Australian people. We want it to go to referendum. We want it to be enshrined in the Constitution. We want our fellow Australians to back us on this because the politicians use us as a political football. And the party system doesn't work for us because they just point score. And meanwhile, our people die 10 years younger than average Australians. You know, we have rheumatic heart disease. We have just, it goes on and on, this thing we politely call the gap. I don't like to talk about it. I get upset about it. But, and now I'm going over 30 seconds. But the thing is, if we don't do this, we're just saying, okay, we're just going to continue to do the same business we've always done, and we're just going to wear all of this stuff. Business as usual. We can't have business as usual. So, yeah. What was the question? Yeah, why don't they legislate it first? Well, we've done that before. Yep.
Yep, thank you. Okay, I think this is the last question. Robert from Cromer Heights asks, what is the Yes campaign doing to reach younger voters like his son and friends who don't know a lot about the referendum?
I'll answer this. Actually, younger voters are in the majority supportive, about 80, we see it sitting around 85%. So we don't have to do much in relation to the younger voters actually because they're on board. So with our limited resources, we are trying to target and talk to groups who are less on board.
Well, he's also asking how you counter some of the TikTok videos. So Rachel, maybe a bit of filmmaking.
I'm going to make my own TikTok videos.
You could do that.
Yeah, no, I'm going to. We're going to make them, aren't we?
Yeah, go Noah.
Because I don't know how to use TikTok. I did go on the other day. It's like, I've got to understand this media. And so I looked at some videos. There was a guy getting a tapeworm extracted from his nose. And it took 5 minutes. I was like, is this what this is? It was totally fascinating. I was like, what have I been missing out on?
Right, well.
Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you. I am going to wrap it up there. Thank you all so much for
Please
all those incredible...
Please don't wrap it up on the tapeworm story.
No.
Because now I feel like I've done a really bad thing. No, I wanted to... Can I say one thing before we finish? Can I just say that we have the Yes 23 McKellar representative, Richard, is there. He's just up there. So if you do want to get involved... You can go to Richard and he can talk to you about all the different things that's happening. You can go to our website, yes23.com.au. Don't feel like you have to. It's just an offer that's there, just if you want to. Also, the Voices of McKellar are running kitchen tables, a great thing. You know all about this. You have 10 people over to your house. You have cups of tea. It's not as boring as a Tupperware party, but you do talk about the Constitution. And you just exchange knowledge about it. And you just do that with 10 people. And, you know, that's the way through these conversations that we get more understanding on this topic. So that's available to you as well.
Thank you both. And Craig and Jeff, would you like to make a closing remark?
Look, it's a pleasure to sit and yarn with you all. And as I think Rachel, through her film work, her storytelling across decades, has done more than any Australian I know to actually make us see the humanity of all of our fellow Australians. And so for us in this gathering tonight, I'm heartened that everyone has listened deeply. There are more Aboriginal voices that you should seek out. And find a way, whoever you know, to lend a hand, you know, to be there, to listen. And I know you will be guided, as my family has been, as to where we can help, where and how we should be there, how to actually move this forward. It is really the art of listening, not so much about talking. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's a wonderful way to end this as well. The power of listening. We all know how incredibly healing, how powerfully healing it is just to be listened to, because it is an incredible and very deep sign of respect. And I would also like to say that thank you all so much for coming tonight. We are incredibly encouraged that there's so many people here who are joining this conversation. There were many people on a wait list as well, so it's wonderful to have you all. We've heard that the Uluru Statement of the Heart really is an invitation to walk together and have a respectful relationship with our First Nations people. I do believe it is an incredibly noble and gracious invitation, and that it can be a moment, this can be a moment for us to unite and to start healing rather than dividing us. It can be a really positive moment, and having you all in this room today is an incredibly positive moment. And we would encourage you to continue the conversation. As Rachel was saying, have those conversations, very respectful conversations. I think quite often it is the listening that makes a big difference, and asking people why they feel a certain way. But have those conversations. We would encourage you to speak with your friends, your family and your colleagues. It's in your hands. It's not in my hands. I'm a politician. You don't need to hear from me. It's in your hands. And starting by having the conversations and listening to one another respectfully is so important. I do also have an immense faith in the innate generosity and the courage of the Australian people. And I think we all feel that our First Nations people and our First Nations children absolutely deserve a fair go. So,
Thank you.
So basically, just thank you so much for coming along tonight. It's been wonderful to have you along, and I want to thank our three speakers, our three panellists tonight, for giving so much to this conversation.
And thank you. Thank you so much.
Look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all again. Good night.